I made the switch to go from a technology leader to an individual contributing seller. And people at my work were like, dude, you're walking away from golden handcuffs and a pension. But I wanted to try it. It's important to answer the questions that those people that are investing in you or the business that's investing in you has to say, look, we're doing this as secure as we can. If you're not doing it on the internet, you're not going to have the explosion that comes with scale. And if you are doing it on the internet, it's a very dangerous place to be doing in transaction business. A lot of the attackers are using Google's artificial intelligence to improve the ways and the methods in which they attack. So the duty and the responsibility lies on all of us, not you, us.
What are some of the types of threats that you're seeing coming in 2025?
There's two things that are happening.
Welcome to the Agathos Consulting Podcast. I'm Seth Neds, the founder and CEO of Agathos Consulting. And today I'm honored to be joined by Aaron Ansari. He works as the Chief Information Security Officer, an advisor, and investor, and he served in multiple other roles in cybersecurity at Trend Micro, Chase, and BMW. Aaron, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'd like to start. I always ask people about their background and how they got into their current role. So could you tell me a little bit about your background and how your career has changed over time?
Absolutely, yeah. I started my career path on a different trajectory. And I actually started in a technology role, developing applications for a bank that you might be familiar with based off of who worked there, Huntington National Banks, and worked on the ATM plastics team, writing code in Transact SQL, Visual Basic, and then some mainframe languages to interact with our DB2 tables. And that just got really technical really quickly. Point being, I started my career in a development trajectory and I started to work on fraud systems for the ATM plastics teams. When you use your debit card, this is back in 00, right? This is a lot different than having a mobile app and text messages and those sorts of things. But when you use your debit card and you would get a phone call from your bank asking if that transaction was valid or if that transaction was fraudulent, that was the system that I wrote for Huntington National Banks. And that's actually what got me into the information security realm because I worked heavily, almost every day, with the fraud team, the customer service team that was responsible for those phone calls, and then the investigatory team that would investigate any alleged or proven fraud on the banking systems and the debit card.
So I was looking at your LinkedIn and watching your journey. And so you've gone from the technical role to sales, and I guess you're back in technical. What was it like switching from working on the technical side and then switching over to more of the sales?
Yeah, and that's not for everyone. And that was something that took time and I'd say trust on behalf of the people that I worked with to transition into sales. So it wasn't a quick, like I didn't start off developing and then instantly switch. It was better part of a decade. It was actually 12 years. It was more than a decade of various technical roles, development of application systems. Then I started getting into application security. Then again, I started getting into application security architecture, all within the financial services realms, a medium regional bank to a global bank to a captive auto finance arm, but still all financial services with progressively responsible roles within those organizations and entities, ultimately culminating in a leadership role for architecture as it related to security. And it was there that I implemented a project that was with a smaller company. I would categorize it as a startup. And we implemented it across North America, a company called FishMe, now called Cofence. And I was talking to the CEO. To be able to talk to the CEO of a technology company, you're not going to do that at Palo Alto, at some of the bigger information security software techs. But with these startups or smaller ones, you can. And he said, we're looking for somebody to help build our product out from a sales perspective, and we want people that have used it. Now, this premise isn't new. In fact, a lot of software companies do this, except they hire in like a sales engineering or a technical account management role. But instead, what was happening here is going back and forth. I talked to this gentleman's name was Rohit, and I talked to him about, I've thought about traditional sales rather than sales engineering and actually driving a project to completion. And I didn't look at it as like sales per se. I looked at it as like each transaction was a project and I had to initiate that project and then work with the stakeholders and then close the project out times however many transactions that we were doing. And it turns out he trusted in me. I trusted in him. I made the switch to go from a technology leader to an individual contributing seller, which a lot of people went side eyes at, and people at my work were, dude, you're walking away from golden handcuffs and a pension and a career trajectory into a CISO sort of thing. But I wanted to try it. I was young enough and risky enough to be able to do it. And thankfully, with the trust that was in both of us and the partnership that we formed to be able to have consistent communication, clear objectives, goals that we were able to achieve together and accomplish based off of a technology that I believed in because I implemented it and I saw what it could do, I had tremendous success. So it was a good journey there.
Since you've been in that sales role, how do you navigate the revenue? Cybersecurity could generate revenue, or it could be, it's mostly looked at as like a cost center.
For sure.
So what are the biggest misconceptions that CEOs have about information security from your time talking to different CEOs?
Yeah, two questions there. One is the misconceptions, and two are how did you manage that sort of, we'll call it sales sort of stuff. The way that I approached it was like bringing the value, and it's the way that I approached every other sales opportunity that I had over the subsequent decade. Plus, lots of startups have come and gone, lots of sales opportunities have come and gone. And my evaluation criteria has been the same. Have I used this technology? Is it valuable? Some people have asked, is it a must have? Is it a nice to have? Some people say, is it a vitamin or a painkiller? There's all sorts of different analogies for boiling down a technology into something maybe a little bit more rudimentary than it is. I don't tend to do that. I tend to look at what does it do? What field is it in? Have I used this in the past? Or is this something that's brand new and not really well understood? Is there an educational component to it? And then you can look at the company and how effective it is and how the sales are doing and those sorts of things from a product standpoint. So that's how I evolved into the various roles that I took since my time at FishMe, which was 6.5+ years, progressively building up sales teams and leadership and those sorts of things. But that's how I looked at that. Now, to the second half of your question, security kind of being a cost center, that's very much how it's still viewed today. It's not like that misconception, or I'll say that conception has been changed or refuted. And there's dual parts to that, right? Like the security team believes that they're a cost center, and the leadership team also believes they're a cost center. What I do to try to encourage the security teams that I manage now or that I interacted with before was talk about not necessarily return on investment, because it is a little bit harder to quantify dollars invested versus dollars saved for a security solution, but rather start quantifying events for risk management, events from stopping a breach and mitigation of a breach and that sort of thing. If you talk about how every month or every week we block this many attacks, we block this many incidents, we investigated and stopped this much fraud, we were involved in certain cases or certain litigation support or these sorts of things, as you start to showcase the value that you're bringing to the business, to say, look, incidents like these typically cost X millions of dollars. How many records are breached? We stopped our entire database from being breached 50 times this past month. Here's how we did it. Here's what we did. And this is how much that would save, right? From an insurance perspective or a payouts perspective. And that insurance piece is important because most organizations have to have cyber liability insurance nowadays. And so when you talk in those numbers and that sort of metrics, you start to bring value towards the business.
When you implement cybersecurity, that probably docks their insurance premium down quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's funny. So the answer is yes. Not quite a bit, but helps with that premium. And then two, most insurance companies that are starting to do this are mandating a certain tech stack or their own tech stack with their policy. Yeah, we'll sell you a cyber liability insurance policy and you have to prove that you have this endpoint and this XDR and this so on. And you have to download our agent to do compliance and monitoring and those sorts of things. So it's really interesting. Are they purveyors of some sort of bloatware that's coming onto your environment? They're obviously getting some sort of kickback, or they're obviously getting some sort of revenue from pushing that as well. But yes, you are helping from a risk standpoint as well as a cost standpoint for savings.
Are there aspects of cybersecurity that could, I'm thinking of a business that's trying to grow or scale, what ways could cybersecurity actually enable them to scale better?
With explosive growth, there's lack of visibility or observability into sort of what's happening across your organization. And when that happens, it's increasing risk. Thankfully, knock on wood, most organizations don't experience something catastrophic or something traumatic from an incident standpoint as they're doing that. But having visibility and knowing what's going on in your environment, especially as you're growing at scale, is challenging. It's also expensive, depending on what you do and who you look at. And there's been this burgeoning field of, I guess I'll say, innovative or consolidated platforms that kind of help you do this at scale inexpensively. And what I mean by that is edge, network, east, west, north, south traffic, right? Like endpoint, log management, SIM, right? Like those sorts of things that are also starting to come into a consolidated single point of glass, single view sort of thing at a reasonable price. And this is a big industry when you start to see the big players mimic the same activity, right? So if you see a Barracuda or an Arista come through and start saying, hey, we do that too, it's because they bought some sort of technology or they consolidated a bunch of technology to be able to make something happen. So it is doable. What I mean to answer your question specifically is how does it enable the growth, right? It enables the growth to be, I'll say, a little less risky, maybe even a lot less risky.
Yeah.
So you can control that growth and have confidence. Typically, as you're doing that growth, there's some sort of investor, there's some sort of loan or some sort of business that sponsors that growth. And it's important to answer the questions that those people that are investing in you or the business that's investing in you has to say, look, we're doing this in a as secure as we can way. Because you're not doing it. If you're not doing it on the internet, you're not going to have the explosion that comes with scale. And if you are doing it on the internet, that's a very dangerous place to be doing in transaction business with all the vulnerabilities and all the misconfigurations that are out there. You want to be certain that the money that you're investing is as protected as it can be.
So a similar question we talk to a lot of SMB businesses, and that's our target audience here. So for those companies, there's less resources that can be put towards cybersecurity. How, with limited resources, can you still prioritize security efforts and ensure you build a resilient defense?
The answer comes with partnerships and with some of those scalable technologies that I talked about. It's unreasonable for a small business to have $1 million+ budgets when it comes to security software packages and security products, right? You're not going to have your own firewall. You're not going to have your own infrastructure. You're not going to have your own security operations center, right? And typically you're just going to buy a computer from Best Buy or somewhere else, and whatever image comes on it is what you're doing. So a couple of things is what I recommend. One is to have some sort of process in place. Like when you get your asset, to have a person or a team responsible for, look, every computer that we get at least needs to have this base level of security turned on or installed, right? If you're buying a Microsoft Windows variant, turn on Defender, turn on ATP, turn on this firewall management and these sorts of things. And that helps, right? Two, your internet service provider typically also offers some sort of enhancement from like a network or a traffic monitoring service at a reasonable rate, right? They're not going to be 24/7 monitoring, but they will offer you some sort of protection that'll say, hey, we notice a bunch of malicious traffic that's coming from your IP address. What's going on? Maybe you should investigate that sort of thing. Three, your web host also will do something similar, right? So if you've got a website, which you probably do, ensure that you buy whatever package comes with it from a security and sort of monitoring sort of thing. So they'll look at, if you're using Squarespace or Wix or whatever, they'll ensure that it's patched, it's up to date, that people aren't maliciously trying to go after it and that sort of thing, and some sort of base level web application firewall or some sort of base level protection that they give you there. So I know I'm taking a little shaving out of every expense, right? So like you're adding an expense to your licensing costs, you're adding an expense to your internet service provider, you're adding an expense to your hosting, but it's not a lot. And it's enough to mitigate the risk that comes with that sort of transaction to say, okay, look, we've got monitoring in the places that we're exposed, and look at your total attack surface area and you say, okay, as long as we can consolidate that as much as we can. Password monitors or password keepers are free typically or very inexpensive. Antivirus is turned on. You've got as much cloud security turned on as possible. If you've got those sort of base checks in place, you're in a good spot. Now, I will say, if you have a little more resources, that field that I mentioned of sort of those consolidated security products is really growing. And you're starting to see these all in one solutions that'll provide everything from endpoint, XDR, SIM, log, file integrity monitoring, vulnerability management, patching, remote desktop management, mobile device asset protection, right? All consolidated into one platform. But approaching that field is a great way to maximize your benefit because you're not spending on all those different solutions all at once. You're just spending one, set of dollars, and you're allocating so much broadly to really mitigate a lot of risk.
Data breaches are, if it happens, is pretty devastating. Do you have any additional steps that CEOs can take to minimize the impact or the potential of that risk?
Yeah, I recommend a retainer. Typically, if you've got some sort of insurance or cyber liability policy, that'll come with an add-on for a retainer of incident response management from some provider or from your insurance provider. I do recommend that because that's probably the most resilient way to ensure that you're as best off as you can be during an incident. Because especially if a ransomware incident happens or double ransomware or something catastrophic happens, a lot of these small businesses don't necessarily know who to turn to. And if you have a retainer with your cyber liability insurance, you can pick up the phone, call them and say, hey, I'm in the middle of it. What do I do? And because you have that retainer, they will work with you and prioritize getting you out of this situation. You can call local law enforcement or FBI regional field office. Crime is happening against you, and you should involve at least the federal agencies that are responsible for this to help you as well.
So, since you're working with a lot of different companies and you're in the loop of what's happening, what are some of the emerging cybersecurity threats that are, if things evolve over time, what are some of the types of threats that you're seeing coming in 2025?
There's two things that are happening. One, the old threats are getting better, right? I think just recently in major news sources, it was announced that a lot of the attackers are using Google's artificial intelligence to improve the ways and the methods in which they attack. So your spam, your SMS-based messaging, your smishing, your pig butchering, your has gotten a lot more professional, as well as a lot more operationalized through the use of large language models and software technologies that have just improved the abilities of these organizations. And they are organizations, they're businesses that are attacking you. It's not just people, to be much more efficient at what they did and what they do, right? So automated calling, scripts, better English, more realistic scenarios, increased attack across social media, right? So you're seeing it hit from multiple angles from a business standpoint. That's always been a threat, but the threat has grown more mature. So that's happening. But then you get into what's emerging, right? And you have these things like quantum computing, and you have new technologies that are coming from, let's say, an artificial standpoint. I hesitate to mention AI as an acronym just because it's so overused. But you've got threats that are coming that are going to be more advanced, that are difficult to detect, and that are what are called, I'll say, chained off of one another. So it's rare to get 0-day as much now versus getting a bunch of low-level unpatched threats chained together. So a CVSS score or a risk score of something that's a category 4 or 5, if you get 10 of those and figure out how to chain them together at an organization that's exposed to those things, then you can expose that organization to something that's higher. So that there are more complex attacks that are coming that are aided by software and technologies that are making them almost impossible to detect or respond to unless you're patched, and much more complex for the average security team to be able to defend against. And that's where having partners and better technologies and layered the defense in depth approach is definitely warranted.
How would a CEO build a culture or improve the culture of security in their organization? Any tips for them?
Yeah, it starts on both ends of an organization, meaning top down and bottom up. Ensure that security is a part of your culture and talk about the prevalence of somebody asks you for gift cards. That's not me. If somebody calls you pretending to be me, it's not me. If your grandson calls you and says they've been in an accident in Mexico, hang up and call them back, right? Training them on the basics of things. and do it in an engaging way. Don't force them to sit down and take an hour-long course. The benefit of a small business is typically most people are in the same place, or you all come to the same Zoom meeting. And so you can weave it into your consistent culture, weekly or monthly or however your cadence is. So bottom up, right? And then top down, right? When you get notifications that say information security, cyber risk is something that's very important to our business, it could derail us completely. Understand the threat that's out there, because it certainly is out there. And understand that the duty and the responsibility lies on all of us, not you, us. And talk about what's happening and raise the general awareness level and education amongst your user base, but also give them a means to give you feedback. Right. So a lot of companies have phishing buttons that just forward the email on. Your email provider, if it's Microsoft 365, might have something like that. Or your internet service provider might have something like that. But just give them a means to interact and at least do some analysis so that they feel as though they're contributing as you talk about it and as you communicate it. To make it very cyclical.
So with different companies that you've worked with, what are some of the most common challenges that you've seen people facing? I'm sure there's reoccurring themes that come up over time.
Yeah, getting everybody just to have a single point to access the information that's out there is crucial. I'll turn this around on you. When you work with your audience on consulting or talking about their business, how often do you find like a small business has like an intranet or like an internal SharePoint page or somewhere where there's information on the company, maybe on the website or something like that? Do you find that very often?
Well, yeah, it seems generally pretty siloed.
Exactly. And so when you don't have means to communicate, you've got the technology. You're not necessarily investing the time to build out something that helps your employees have this watering hole to go to and get information, not just about cybersecurity, but about the business, contracts, policies, how your company works. And it could even be just like a folder share, as basic as something as it's free with whatever service you're using. But when you start to invest time, not money necessarily, into increasing communication and increasing like, hey, for our cyber liability insurance, we had to have an acceptable use policy. We had to have an internet policy. We had to have all these various policies on email security and those sorts of things. We put all those here in this folder. Go there and understand that they're there. And when you can, consume them. Understand that you got to do your job. And sitting there and reading some document isn't exciting or something that I necessarily want to pay you an hour to do. But it is important because that little bit of investment up front and giving the means to do that investment. Here's all our policies. Here's where they sit. Here's company information on some sort of SharePoint page or on some sort of M365 sort of, we'll say, notes or just something that's there really helps. And you can put other information there, but having some sort of snippet or some sort of bit on cyber and what's happening in the world. And you can subscribe to feeds that do this automatically for you and that sort of thing. But I encourage most of the small businesses and organizations that I have to have some sort of central communication methodologies. Most balk at it. Dude, I don't have time for that. I'm trying to make this widget or I'm trying to do this consulting services. And it's a shame because it's something that sort of should be set up at the beginning. And then cared and maintained as time goes on versus this Herculean effort to put it all together and manage it. But I definitely recommend it.
Do you have any recommended cybersecurity news sources for CEOs to kind of stay in touch with what's going on?
I do. Maybe in the show notes or in some sort of document, I can share with you an entire list. I actually do have, I'll say 20 different sources, everything from dark reading and darknet diaries and those sorts of things to maybe a few lesser known Krebs on security and some lesser known things that while you might not take the time every day to read, weekly is a good thing. And actually what I'm finding more so now in major media is coverage of cyber and cyber threats. You open the Wall Street Journal, you open the New York Times, you open the Washington Post, and you'll see Salt Typhoon and some recent things that are happening as it relates to nation state attackers and cyber threat on the main page in those applications. So it is interesting to see that this is becoming very much a mainstream sort of news component, as well as you don't have to go hunt it out as much anymore.
In your career so far, do you have like a story or a time that was really challenging and maybe something that didn't go as planned or did, but maybe some things you've learned from throughout your career? And
a lot. I mentioned being in a couple startups. Some of them went really well. Some of them no longer exist. And that's challenging, right? When you're at an organization that says we don't have any more money and pencils down and figure out what you're going to do next. Communication from leadership down to the staff level could have been a lot better retroactively, right? Because everyone's told it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, we've got money, and then the next day is, oops, we were lying. You don't have time to react and figure out what to do next. And that's across the startup world and the nature of something that's so fledgling and not necessarily stable. It's happened twice. And I'll tell you, it's not a good feeling, especially to understand that you're not getting a paycheck the next week or ever unless you do something now. And eating my own dog food there, the do something now isn't something that you can just go out and be like, hey, everyone, I need your help right now. It's the years of investing in your network and in people around you. And this is non-cyber, but in the people around you to have a good reputation and to be known for something. So it involves being, active in your community and being a trusted resource and doing things like this to be able to be, known a little bit more so that if something tragic or something catastrophic happens, you're ready. Like I just said, with the investment in cyber and the investment in communications, it needs to happen early on so that if something happens, you've got your retainer or you're ready, or as ready as you can be to process through something like that. So that's happened a couple of times in my career, and it's certainly challenging to understand what to do and how to go about doing what's next. Thankfully, because of the network and the investment and the contacts that I've had, I've been able to be quite resilient, able to transition really well. And the second thing is, just as you alluded to in your questions at the beginning of this podcast, was having a diverse background, right? So having a technical background that I could go back to and maintaining that technology or technical background over the course of my sales career. Something I didn't mention was I kept up on certifications. I kept up on education. I took classes. I taught classes. I was still active in the community from a technology standpoint. I wasn't day-to-day hands-on involved in it, but I talked to my internal developers and I talked to my internal team about security pretty regularly and consistently. And so when I had to pivot back from a career sales role back to being a CISO, I was able to do with trust, with a reputation that showed that I was still as technically capable or competent as I had been, if not better, with more perspective on understanding revenue, understanding the operation side of organizations, to be able to say and talk information security with that understanding that I mentioned before about risk calculations and quantifications of the sort of the dollar that spends that happens there.
Do you enjoy the technical side better or the business side?
I would say it depends on the role that you're in and the time that you're looking at. If you were to ask me that a couple of years ago, I would say, yeah, I'm happy here and enjoying it. Ask it now, I'm happy here and enjoying it. So it's a little bit more about being happy and content in the present. That's very important, to be settled and resolved to dedicate yourself to what you're in right now and not necessarily always thinking the grass is greener or wondering what something else will be like. But I will say, having the versatility and seeing the multiple facets of operations and business standpoint, at some point, as you progress in your career, the two converge. And as I say right now, if you're a CISO, you have to understand finance and quantify value and cost and return on investment and those sorts of things. I understand it intimately because I was generating it and responsible for it and reporting on it and that sort of thing. But regardless of your trajectory to get to be a CISO or an information leader, you really should understand how your business makes money, and not only money, profit, and how that profit ties back to the things that you're doing. So I've been very blessed and thankful for the path that I've had to get me here and the multifaceted approach that I've had to be able to do that.
Do you think the future will be more specialized? Is it to your advantage if you dive deep into one area, or do you think you should stay broad across multiple areas?
I'm not trying to be a lawyer here, but it depends, right? It depends on what you want to do. You can see people that are very specialized that have and good at what they do. Not only are you specialized, but you're top talent at what you do that kind of are consistently known in their branding and their network for, I'm the AWS person as it relates to security. That speaks volumes, and that typically tends to have career success in that path. Whereas in a generalization standpoint, when there's a bunch of layoffs, when the market's flooded with resources and you're a generalist, it's tough to specialize or stand out, right? If you do the same thing that 150 other thousand people are doing and there's one job, it's really going to be hard to stand out there. I would say it depends on what you're after, but even as you generalize in your capabilities, if you can, sounds like a bad term, but if you can silo those into, hey, I'm a generalist, but I'm a generalist at what I do, and I do them really well in the world of insurance or in the world of financial services, in the world of fraud detection or those sorts of things, that tends to help mitigate some of the risk that could come with being a so-called generalist.
Do you have any additional advice or anything you want to leave CEOs with?
Oh, for sure. CEOs are responsible for a lot. And there's a lot of pressure on them to meet the needs of the people they employ, their family, the responsibilities that they might have across a community, and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on a CEO. And whether you're a CEO of a one-person company or a 1,000-person company, you're in that role because you want to do it and you want to perform and you want to bring your business or your value to other people and you believe in it, right? As you're building out your team and as you're building out your resources, it's cliche to say hire people that have the same vision and values as you do. Nobody's going to have the same passion that you do about your business, but you can hire people that have sort of that close level of things. Specifically, as you get into technology and information security, find the resources and then the partners that share that level of intensity. I'm not saying share your vision and value because nobody's going to care about your business as much as you do. But if I care about security and if I care about securing my customers as much as you care about your business, we're going to find a commonality there that says, look, this is my business. My business is securing my customers. If you're going to be my customer, my business is to make sure that you're as secure as I can make you. And I'm just as passionate about doing that as you are about making your business a success. And that's a lot easier said than done because unfortunately in the sales role, people will come and shine up and be like, hey, I love this as much as you do. And I care and it's so great. And then you never talk to them again after the sale or something like that. That's never a good thing. So I would say seek out the genuineness in your security partner or your technology partner because it'll turn out to be a great, rewarding partnership for you.
Do you have any favorite business books that you would recommend?
I've got some of them sitting behind me. I actually recommend The First 90 Days to everybody that I talk to because it's a great way to compartmentalize. It doesn't just have to be 90 days of your business, but it's a great way to sort of compartmentalize your season and your business season as you can go through and build the phases of your business because it's very helpful to have this mentality and the way to think about immediate, short-term, long-term tasks and functions that you can do. And I use that a lot in the way that I run my team, as well as the way that I build out how I'm going to make a plan or a roadmap for the year.
So if someone was trying to get some fractional CISO services or reach out to you, what would be the best ways to contact you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way because you can look back and see the last 19 years, I think I've been on LinkedIn 20 years worth of things that I've said, and that'll prove that it's in the pudding. So find me on LinkedIn.
That's great. Thanks you so much, Aaron, for being on the show. It's great to have you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.